"I do," took barely 3 seconds to whisper. 3 seconds that curdled the champagne and the crystal flutes, froze the breath of 200 elite guests, and turned a multi-billion-dollar union into a catastrophe that could never be undone. Imani Brooks felt the change instantly. The air in the outdoor cathedral grew heavy and static, as if the white floral arches were closing in to entomb her. She had barely finished her vow before the world stopped moving. She stood there, poised and ethereal, her white lace wedding dress pristine and her expression a mask of practiced devotion. She was ready to receive the ring, ready to cement her place in the heart of a syndicate. But the man at the altar didn't reach for her hand. Yu Min-suk sat, then slumped, a sharp-suited monolith of iron and secrets, his body casting a long, dark shadow over the gravel aisle. His presence had always been suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress, hands large and capable, resting on the world as if he owned the ground beneath the city. It was a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout because its silence was law. Imani's steady hand twitched. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had overplayed her hand, if her deep cover handlers had led her into a trap she couldn't escape. "Min-suk?" she asked, her voice lower and steadier than the pounding of her heart. Beside him, Dr. C.O. Kongjin dropped to his knees, his eyes rising not to the groom's face, but to Imani's trembling hands. His gaze was dark, piercing, and suddenly shimmering with a lethal realization. He didn't offer help. He didn't call for an ambulance. He searched her face with a raw, clinical intensity, as if she were the only person in the garden who knew why the monster had fallen. Then, as the doctor whispered the truth into the silence, the bride did the one thing no one expected. She ran. If this mystery has you gripped, smash that like button and share this with someone who believes in love beyond the grave. Subscribe and hit the bell. Long before the lace and the lilies, there was the cold, clinical silence of the Sub-Level 6 facility. Imani Brooks had learned early that in the world of high-stakes espionage, the most effective weapon isn't the one you carry, but the one you become. Her training hadn't been just about ballistics or linguistics. It was an exercise in the systematic erasure of the self. They taught her to breathe in rhythms that didn't disturb the air and to mirror the emotions of her targets until her own heart felt like a foreign object. The agency called it the Ghost Protocol, a process of turning a human being into a living conduit for information. For 18 months, Imani lived in the shadows of Seoul's underbelly, perfecting the role of a high society curator with just enough mystery to draw a man like Yu Min-suk out of his fortress. She was the perfect bait, beautiful, intelligent, and seemingly untethered to any world that could threaten his own. But the true initiation happened on the eve of the operation's final phase. It was a marking ceremony, though it felt more like a desecration. In a room scrubbed of color, under the humming glow of UV lights, the agency's lead chemist had applied a translucent, scentless serum to the pulse points of her wrists and the nape of her neck. It was a revolutionary forensic tag, a synthetic protein chain designed to bond with her DNA. To the naked eye, she was just a bride-to-be. To the agency's specialized satellites, she was a glowing beacon. "It's harmless to you," the chemist had lied, his voice as flat as a dial tone. But once you are in sustained physical contact with the target, once your skin meets his in the intimacy of a vow, the transfer will be complete. He will be marked. We will be able to track his every movement through every lead line bunker and every deep-sea vault until the syndicate is mapped to the millimeter. Imani had looked at her hands that night, wondering if she would ever feel clean again. She was a marked woman, carrying a secret that was literally woven into her skin. They told her it was for the greater good, a necessary price for dismantling a century of blood and iron. They never told her that the marker had a secondary function, a fail-safe meant to ensure that neither the hunter nor the prey would ever leave the altar alive. As she stood before the mirror, adjusting a veil that felt like a shroud, she realized she wasn't just an agent anymore. She was the ticking clock at her own wedding. The luxury outdoor ceremony was a masterclass in curated peace, a sprawling garden of white peonies and soft cello music that masked the jagged edges of the U Syndicate. Under the golden hue of the soul sunset, the guests sat in rows of ivory chairs, their faces frozen in expressions of practiced elegance. At the center of it all stood Min Suk, a man who had spent his life as a predator, now appearing almost human in the sharp lines of his black tuxedo. Imani felt the weight of the marker on her skin, a phantom heat burning against her pulse as she looked into his eyes. For a fleeting second, the mission vanished. She didn't see the head of a crime family. She saw the man who had whispered about a quiet life in the countryside, a man who looked at her not as an asset, but as an anchor. The priest's voice was a rhythmic drone, drifting toward the finality of the union. "I do," Min Suk whispered, his voice low and unusually raspy. The air shifted. The strength that had defined him for decades seemed to evaporate in a single heartbeat. His hand, usually as steady as granite, began to tremble against hers. Then, with a sickening, heavy thud that silenced the cello and froze the champagne in the guests' glasses, the monolith fell. Min Suk slumped to the marble floor, his body limp and his eyes rolling back into a hollow, sightless stare. The silence lasted only a second before it was shattered by a chorus of gasps and the frantic scraping of chairs. Imani dropped to her knees, her white lace dress billowing around her like a dying swan. Her hand shook as she reached for him, but a firm, cold hand intercepted her. Dr. C.O. Kongjin, the family's private physician, was already there, his face a mask of clinical urgency. He didn't look at Min Suk's face first. He didn't check for a blocked airway. Instead, he seized Min Suk's wrist, pulling back the silk cuff of the tuxedo. His eyes darted to the place where Imani's skin had touched his moments before. Under the setting sun, a faint, iridescent shimmer, a violet bruising that shouldn't exist in nature, began to bloom across the groom's pulse point. The doctor's breath hitched. He looked up, his gaze locking onto Imani with a terrifying, silent clarity. He didn't see a grieving bride. He saw a biological signature. In that moment, the altar of love became a crime scene of forensic precision. The doctor knew, and Imani knew he knew. The trap hadn't just been set, it had already snapped shut. The garden, once a symphony of celebratory murmurs, had fallen into a vacuum of terrified silence. Dr. C.O. Kongjin did not call for the oxygen tank or the paramedics standing by the gate. Instead, his fingers remained locked around Min Suk's wrist with a grip that looked more like an arrest than a medical examination. His eyes, sharp and clinical, traced the faint, bioluminescent shimmer that was now pulsating beneath the groom's skin, a violet bruise that looked like a constellation of dying stars. Imani leaned forward, her long veil dipping into the gravel, her breath hitching in her throat. She tried to reach for Min Suk's hand, but the doctor's free hand shot up, a silent, rigid barrier. He leaned in, his shoulders shielding their exchange from the prying eyes of the guests and the rising panic of the lieutenants. The scent of antiseptic and cold sweat replaced the fragrance of the peonies. "You should have worn gloves, Agent," the doctor whispered, his voice a jagged sliver of ice that sliced through the humid evening air. Imani's heart didn't just skip, it seemed to stop entirely. The world blurred at the edges, the white lace of her sleeves suddenly feeling like a leaden weight. She looked at her own fingertips, seeing the microscopic residue of the serum that her handlers had promised was a harmless tracker. "It's a chimera, 7 marker," Kongjin continued, his voice so low it was almost lost to the wind. a high-end forensic tag designed for extrajudicial liquidations. It doesn't just track Imani. It binds to the target's nervous system and induces a localized autonomic collapse. You didn't just mark him for the agency. You signaled the kill switch. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The marking ceremony in the basement, the chemist's empty promises, the sustained contact of the wedding vows. It was all a synchronized execution. She wasn't the hunter. She was the delivery system for a death sentence. He was going to give it all up for you, the doctor hissed, his gaze flickering to the armed men, now rushing toward the altar. He spent the last 6 months cleaning the ledgers to give you a life without shadows. And you brought the shadows into his very blood. He looked back at her, his expression shifting from clinical observation to a raw, lethal judgment. The lieutenants see a medical emergency. I see his signature. If I tell them what this violet stain is, if I tell them who you really are, you won't make it to the garden gate. He paused, his thumb pressing into the mark on Min-suk's skin as the groom's breathing grew shallow and ragged. Run, the doctor commanded, a final, twisted mercy. Run before I decide that his life is worth more than the secret you're carrying. Imani didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the man she had inadvertently poisoned or the life she had dreamed of. She gathered the heavy folds of her embroidered skirt, turned her back on the altar of secrets, and vanished into the treeline. The ivory chairs that had felt like thrones only minutes ago now resembled a labyrinth of white-boned obstacles. Imani gathered the heavy, satin-lined folds of her skirt, the floral embroidery catching on the manicured edges of the garden as she moved. The air was no longer filled with the soft strains of the cello. It was replaced by the staccato rhythm of panic, the sharp intake of breaths, the frantic clinking of jewelry, and the low, confused shouts of the syndicate's security detail. She didn't run like a bride. She ran like the operative she had been forged to be. Her movements were a blur of white silk against the deepening shadows of the estate. To the guests, she was a woman consumed by grief, a tragic figure fleeing the sight of her fallen groom. But beneath the veil, her eyes were scanning for exits, calculating the distance to the perimeter fence, and identifying the men whose hands were already moving toward their concealed holsters. Imani. Stop. The voice of Minho, the syndicate's second-in-command, boomed over the garden. It wasn't the call of a concerned friend. It was the command of a predator who had smelled blood in the water. She didn't turn. She wove through a group of socialites who stood frozen like porcelain statues, their mouths agape. One woman reached out to touch her arm, a gesture of hollow comfort, but Imani pivoted with a surgical grace that sent her stumbling back. Every second spent in the garden was a second closer to the moment the doctor's silence would break. Every heartbeat was a countdown until the violet mark on Min-suk's wrist was identified for what it truly was, a signature of betrayal. She reached the edge of the fountain, the water shimmering with the same iridescent violet hue that haunted her mind. She could hear the heavy thud of tactical boots on the gravel behind her. The gilded cage was closing. She reached the iron gate at the rear of the property, her lungs burning not from the exertion, but from the toxic weight of the secret she carried. With a final, desperate surge, she vaulted over the low stone wall, the delicate lace of her veil snagging on a rose bush and tearing away. A ghost of a bride left hanging in the thorns. She hit the dirt road on the other side, the luxury of the estate vanishing into the dark, indifferent woods. Behind her, the lights of the wedding began to flicker as the security team scrambled. She was no longer the centerpiece of a multi-billion-dollar union. She was a marked woman in the wilderness, stripped of her cover, her mission, and the man she had accidentally killed. The forest swallowed her whole, the white of her dress flickering like a dying star through the trees until there was nothing left but the sound of her own ragged breath and the cold, distant mechanical hum of the agency's satellites watching from above. The darkness of the woods was not a sanctuary. It was a cold, indifferent witness to the shattering of Imani's world. She crouched in the hollow of a lightning-scarred oak, her white lace dress now a jagged, dirt-stained ruin that mocked the purity it was meant to represent. With trembling fingers, she reached into the hidden seam of her bodice, pulling out the encrypted microcomms unit she had been instructed to use only in the event of a successful extraction. The device hummed to life, a tiny amber light flickering like a dying pulse. "Echo lead, this is Asset Phoenix," she whispered, her voice cracking against the silence of the trees. "The target has been marked. Unexpected biological reaction. Min-Suk is down, requesting immediate extraction at Point Bravo." The silence that followed was longer than any tactical delay she had ever experienced. When the voice finally came through, it wasn't her handler's familiar, gruff tone. It was a synthesized, flat frequency that carried the weight of a funeral shroud. "Asset Phoenix, extraction is not authorized. The Chimera 7 protocol has reached terminal phase." Imani's breath hitched. "Terminal?" The chemist said it was a tracker. The doctor at the scene, he called it a kill switch. "I need the dampener." Echo lead. "I'm exposed." "You aren't just exposed, Imani," the voice replied. And for the first time, she heard the clinical cruelty behind the mission. "You are the secondary host." The marker was designed to bridge. Once the transfer to the target is complete, the remaining serum in your system undergoes a rapid oxidative process. It ensures no witnesses, no trail, no loose ends. The comms unit went dead in her hand, the amber light turning a solid, mocking red. The truth settled over her like a shroud. The agency hadn't just sent her to kill a man. They had sent her to be the murder weapon and the evidence, both destined for the same grave. They had known Min-Suk was attempting to leave the syndicate. They had known he was going to turn over the ledgers. They didn't want justice. They wanted a total erasure of the U-line, and they had used her heart as the delivery system. She looked down at her wrists. In the pale moonlight, the same violet shimmer she had seen on Min-Suk was beginning to bloom beneath her own skin, a beautiful, lethal glow tracing the veins that led directly to her heart. Her handlers had calculated everything. The wedding, the vow, the kiss, knowing that the closer she got to him, the faster they would both burn out. She wasn't an agent anymore. She was a ghost in waiting, betrayed by the very people who had taught her how to bleed for a cause. As the first wave of a cold, synthetic fever washed over her, Imani realized that if she was going to die, she wouldn't do it as a pawn. She would find her own way back to the altar of secrets. As the synthetic fever began to claw at the back of her mind, Imani's consciousness drifted, pulled back into the fragments of a memory she had once dismissed as part of the long con. She remembered a rainy Tuesday in April, for months before the wedding, in the soundproof sanctuary of Min-Suk's private study. The air had been thick with the scent of old paper and the cedarwood he favored. She had been searching for a digital ledger, her fingers ghosting over his mahogany desk, when he had entered unexpectedly. He hadn't caught her in the act. Instead, he had looked at her with a profound, weary tenderness that made her skin crawl with guilt. He didn't see an agent. He saw a future. He had sat heavily in the chair, not like a king of the underworld, but like a man carrying the weight of a crumbling mountain. Without a word, he had slid a thick, leather-bound dossier toward her. It wasn't the criminal ledger she was hunting. It was a comprehensive divestment strategy, a plan to dismantle the U Syndicate's shipping interests and convert their holdings into a transparent, legitimate maritime foundation. "I've spent 20 years building a fortress," he had said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike her heart. "But a fortress is just a fancy name for a cage. I don't want you to live in the shadows of what I've done, Imani. I want to be the man you think I am." The memory shifted, sharper and more painful. She recalled the night he had showed her a small, hand-drawn map of a vineyard in the south, a place far from the neon-soaked corruption of Seoul. He had already purchased it under a name that wasn't his own, a name they would share. He had been quietly leaking the identities of his most violent lieutenants to an anonymous tip line, clearing the path so that when he stepped away, the machine would have no heart left to beat. He was the ghost in the machine, a man working from within to destroy the very monster the agency claimed they wanted to stop. Imani realized now, with a chilling clarity that burned hotter than the fever, that the agency hadn't marked him because he was a criminal. They had marked him because he was a witness who knew too much about the high-level officials who profited from the syndicate's existence. He was a hero in a villain's skin, and she had been the blind executioner sent to ensure he never told his story. The vineyard was never a dream. It was a sanctuary he was building for her, while she was busy weaving his shroud. The neon lights of Seoul had become a jagged, Technicolor cage. Imani discarded the remnants of her white lace train in a rain-slicked alleyway, the expensive silk now a trail of breadcrumbs for the wolves. She moved through the narrow arteries of the city, her breath hitching not from the cold, but from a synthetic fever that was turning her pulse into a rhythmic hammer. Behind her, the city didn't just feel alive, it felt weaponized. The syndicate didn't need sirens or flashing lights. They owned the shadows between the street lamps. Black sedans with tinted windows drifted through the intersections like sharks in a reef, their tires whispering against the wet asphalt. Every security camera perched on a convenience store was now a cold, unblinking eye for Minho and the lieutenants. They weren't looking for a bride anymore. They were hunting a ghost who had committed the ultimate sacrilege. Imani ducked into the subterranean labyrinth of a 24-hour subway station, the sterile fluorescent hum vibrating against her skull. She caught her reflection in a grime-streaked window. Her hair was coming undone, and the violet glow beneath the skin of her neck was becoming impossible to hide, a neon target in a city of millions. Suddenly, the rhythmic click of heavy soles on the tile floor echoed from the platform entrance. 3 men in charcoal suits emerged, their hands resting inside their jackets with a practiced, lethal weight. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They simply spread out, cutting off the angles of escape with the clinical efficiency of a firing squad. The doctor told us everything, Imani. Minho's voice crackled through a nearby burner phone she had scavenged from a trash bin. He said you were a marker. He said you were the reason the boss is rotting in a bed. You won't leave this city as a ghost. You'll leave it as an example. She didn't wait for the circle to close. Imani vaulted over the turnstile, the motion a blur of desperation and ingrained muscle memory. She plunged into the service tunnels, the smell of ozone and damp concrete filling her lungs. The gilded cage was no longer a metaphor. The entire city was a sprawling trap of iron and blood. Her own agency had abandoned her to the wolves, and the wolves were closing in, driven by the righteous fury of men who believed they were avenging their king. She was the most hated woman in the underworld, and as the roar of an approaching train shook the walls, she realized that to survive the siege, she would have to stop running from the shadows and start becoming one. The synthetic fever was no longer a tremor. It was a rhythmic searing of her nerves, a violet fire that pulsed in time with the city's heartbeat. Imani knew she was dying, but the agency's betrayal had gifted her a cold, crystalline clarity that no training could simulate. To save Min Suk and herself, she had to return to the belly of the beast, the sublevel 6 facility, the very place where her soul had been systematically erased. She didn't approach the front gates of the innocuous glass office tower that served as the agency's front. Instead, she entered through a steam vent in a forgotten industrial laundry 3 blocks away. Her white wedding lace was gone, replaced by a stolen technician's jumpsuit, but the marker beneath her skin acted as a skeleton key. The facility's automated sensors recognized her biological signature, the doors sliding open with a hiss that sounded like a welcoming snake. They expected her to be a corpse by now. They didn't expect a ghost to come home for a haunting. The interior of the facility was a cathedral of chrome and silence. Imani moved through the corridors with a predatory grace, her vision occasionally fracturing into kaleidoscopic shards of violet. She reached the secure pharmacy, the air thick with the smell of ozone and clinical detachment. There, behind a wall of reinforced polycarbonate, sat the dampener, the only synthesized protein chain capable of stabilizing the Chimera 7 reaction. She didn't use an explosive. She simply pressed her palm against the biometric scanner. The machine chirped, reading the lethal toxin in her blood as a level 5 clearance. The glass slid back, revealing a row of elegant silver vials. As she gripped the cold metal, a voice echoed through the sterile room, amplified by the overhead speakers. "You were always our finest asset, Imani. Even now, you're completing the cycle." It was the lead chemist, his tone devoid of malice or mercy. "But the antidote isn't a cure. It's a stay of execution. Why waste on a dead man?" Imani didn't answer. She took 2 vials, one for the man she had accidentally poisoned, and one for the woman she was trying to remember how to be. She bypassed the security elevators, plunging instead into the dark verticality of the disposal chutes. As she hit the rain-slicked pavement of the alleyway outside, the violet glow in her veins seemed to dim, suppressed by the weight of the silver in her hand. She had robbed her creators, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't following a mission. She was starting a revolution of 2. The agency had turned her into a weapon. She was finally going to choose her own target. The air in the private wing of the syndicate's hospital was thick with the sterile, artificial chill of a tomb. Imani moved through the shadows of the corridor, her technician's jumpsuit a dark blur against the polished white tile. The violet glow beneath her skin was a low, rhythmic throb now, a dying ember that signaled her time was nearly up. She reached the heavy, reinforced door of the ICU, the biometric lock yielding once more to the toxic signature in her blood. The room beyond was a cathedral of monitors and hissing respirators, the only sound the mechanical breathing of a man who had once commanded the city with a whisper. Min-suk lay beneath the clinical glare of the surgical lights, his skin the color of parched earth, the violet bruising at his throat now a dark, necrotic web. Beside him, silhouetted against the glow of the heart monitor, stood Dr. Seo Kongjin. He didn't turn as Imani entered. He simply adjusted the flow of an 4 drip, his movements precise and cold. "I told you to run, Imani," the doctor said, his voice a dry rasp that didn't break the silence so much as hollow it out. "Running was the only mercy you were ever going to get." Imani stepped into the light, the silver vial of the dampener clutched in her hand like a holy relic. "I'm not here for mercy, doctor. I'm here for the truth." Kongjin finally turned, his gaze falling on the vial. A flicker of something, not fear, but a weary, academic interest, passed over his face. "The agency's fail-safe. You actually went back for it. A sentimental gesture for a man who is already a ghost." "He was going to go clean," Imani countered, her voice trembling with the effort to stay upright as the synthetic fever peaked. "He was going to dismantle the machine. You didn't find a mark on him at the wedding, Kongjin. You recognized it because you helped him calibrate it." The doctor's silence was his confession. He didn't deny the accusation. He simply looked at Min-suk with a detached pity. "The syndicate is a structural necessity, agent." Min-suk was a flaw in the design. He thought he could be a man in a world of monsters. "I merely ensured the machine remained intact." "The machine is broken," Imani hissed, stepping toward the bed. She raised the silver vial, the needle catching the light. "And I'm the one who's going to stop the heart." Kong Jin reached for the sidearm holstered beneath his lab coat, but his movements were sluggish compared to the desperate, terminal speed of a woman with nothing left to lose. Imani didn't go for her own weapon. She lunged forward, not at the doctor, but at the foreport connected to Min Suk's arm. If he dies with the truth in his veins, she whispered, plunging the needle home. As the clear, stabilizing protein surged into Min Suk's system, the monitors began to scream. The erratic, jagged lines of his heartbeat began to smooth into a steady, rhythmic thud. The violet bruising on his neck visibly receded, the synthetic poison retreating before the cure. Kong Jin stood frozen, his hand still on his weapon, watching the impossible resurrection of the man he had tried to erase. The final treatment wasn't just a cure. It was the first act of a war the doctor was no longer prepared to fight. Imani collapsed against the side of the bed, her own pulse slowing as she pressed the second vial against her thigh, the two of them tethered by a silver thread in a room full of ghosts. The steady, rhythmic thud of the heart monitor was no longer a funeral march. It was a drumbeat of defiance. As the silver fluid of the dampener neutralized the last of the violet toxins, the gray pallor of Min Suk's skin began to flush with the warmth of returning life. His eyes flickered, the lids heavy with the weight of the void he had just stepped back from, before they snapped open with a sharp, predatory clarity. He didn't look at the sterile white ceiling or the blinking diagnostic machines. His gaze went instantly to Imani, who was slumped against the side of his bed, her breath shallow and her own pulse slowing into a safe, muted rhythm. He saw the ruined jumpsuit, the dirt beneath her fingernails, and the two empty silver vials. He saw the woman who had been sent to erase him, and the woman who had nearly died to bring him back. Imani, he rasped, the word a jagged stone in his throat. Beside them, Dr. C.O. Kong Jin stood paralyzed, his hand still hovering over the cold steel of his weapon. The machine had failed. The perfect execution had been undone by a variable the agency never accounted for: the choice of the asset. Min Suk sat up, his movement slow but possessed of a new, terrifyingly calm authority. He didn't reach for the doctor or the alarm. He reached for Imani's hand, his large, scarred fingers interlacing with hers, the contact no longer a lethal transfer, but a grounded, human connection. He looked up at Kong Jin, and for the first time in 20 years, the boss of the U Syndicate wasn't looking at a subordinate. He was looking at a ghost of his past. "The wedding is over, Doctor," Min Suk said, his voice gaining the resonant strength of a man who had finally found his center. "And so is the Empire. Tell Minho and the others that the boss is dead. Tell the agency that the marker did its work. You would throw it all away?" Kong Jin hissed, his professional composure finally cracking into disbelief. "The ships, the ports, the legacy of the U-Line? For an agent who was meant to bury you, I'm not throwing it away," Min Suk replied, his eyes never leaving Imani's face. "I'm trading a cage for a life. The ledgers are already in the hands of the international press. By sunrise, the U Syndicate will be a footnote in a history book. There is no empire left to lead." He turned to Imani, the monolith of iron, finally shattering to reveal the man beneath. "You told me once that you wanted to see the vineyards in the south. You said the light there was different." Imani felt the last of the synthetic fever break, replaced by a surge of raw, unvarnished hope. "I did," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been since the altar. "Then let's go," Min Suk said, pulling her close as he stood, the hospital gown a far cry from the black tuxedo, yet he had never looked more like a leader. The monster died at the altar. Only the man remains. They walked out of the ICU together, two shadows moving through a world of chrome and secrets, leaving the machine behind to rust in the silence of their departure. The last vow wasn't spoken in front of a priest or a crowd of elite guests. It was a silent pact made in the ruins of a betrayal, a promise that from this moment on, they would belong to no one but themselves. The morning sun rose over the southern coast, not with the harsh, artificial glare of Seoul's neon, but with a soft, honeyed light that seemed to dissolve the very memory of the shadows. The vineyard stretched out before them, a sea of emerald vines heavy with the promise of a harvest that had nothing to do with blood or debt. Here, the air didn't taste of ozone and gunpowder. It tasted of salt spray and ripening earth. Imani stood on the weathered wooden porch of the farmhouse, her fingers tracing the smooth grain of the railing. She no longer wore the white lace that had been her shroud, nor the sterile jumpsuit of her betrayal. She wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal wrists that were clear of any violet shimmer. The marker was gone, neutralized by the antidote and purged by the sheer distance they had put between themselves and the world that had tried to erase them. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Min Suk stepped out, dressed in the rugged clothes of a man who worked the land. The monolith of iron had been replaced by someone softer, his movements unburdened by the constant weight of a concealed weapon or a crumbling empire. He stopped beside her, his presence no longer a suffocating force, but a steady, grounding warmth. "The light is different here," he said softly, repeating the words that had once been a desperate dream in a sterile hospital room. Imani turned to him, seeing the man she had risked everything to save. "It's because there are no shadows for it to hide in." They knew the world hadn't forgotten them entirely. The agency would spend years scrubbing the digital ghosts they had left behind, and the remnants of the syndicate would eventually be swallowed by smaller, hungrier wolves. But for the first time in their lives, they weren't assets, targets, or bosses. They were simply two people who had looked into the abyss of their own masks and chosen to step away. As they walked down the steps and into the rows of vines, the silence between them was no longer a death sentence. It was a sanctuary. They had proven that the machine, whether built of criminal iron or institutional ice, could be broken by a single, defiant heartbeat. Their escape hadn't been found in a fast car or a deep-sea vault, but in the quiet courage to be human in a world that demanded they be monsters. The shadows were behind them now, lost in the brilliance of a morning that belonged to no one but them. Love hadn't just been a catalyst for change. It had been the only true exit from the gilded cage.